If you have spent any time at all in online spaces, where discussions of martial arts, sword fighting, or samurai occur, then you will almost certainly have been exposed to the name of Miyamoto Musashi. Musashi was an itinerant swordsman who lived between the late Muromachi and the early Edo period. There is some evidence that he participated in at least 4 battles over his lifetime, the last of which was during the siege of Hara Castle in 1638, during the suppression of the Shimabara Rebellion. He is recorded as having acted in an advisory role where he was struck by a rock and injured. All in all, Musashi did not become famous for his prowess on the battlefield. His fame owes to being known as a kensei, traditionally translated as sword saint, because of his proficiency with the sword. According to the traditional account, during his 15-year-long Musha Shugyo, or warrior's pilgrimage, Musashi participated in some 60 duels, winning each and every one. His most famous duel occurred in 1610, but is traditionally dated to 1612, against a figure who is commonly known as Sasaki Kojiro, but there is some debate if this was in fact his actual name. He began writing his first treatise in 1605 and would continue to write several additional scrolls over the course of his lifetime, culminating in the work Goden no Sho, commonly called the Book of 5 Rings. Goden no Sho is first and foremost a text about sword fighting, and, at a slightly more abstract level, general strategy relating to combat and war. It was the more generalized lessons on strategy which American business and self-improvement writers latched onto. The text was popularized in North America during the wave of corporate Japanophilia in the 1970s and 80s, which saw businessmen and CEOs turning to so-called samurai texts to see if there was some hidden secret to explain Japan's economic miracle. Goden no Sho can be a complex text, because much of it assumes a degree of familiarity with 17th century Kenjutsu and Musashi's own Ninten Ichi-ryu Kenjutsu style. Owing to this, and the necessity of the translation into English, it can become easy to see how without the prerequisite knowledge, it may be easier to adapt individual passages into so-called pearls of wisdom, easily digestible when removed from the martial and historic context. So with this background information in mind, let us turn our attention now to the topic for today's video. Miyamoto Misquoted. Inspirational image plus text. There is a heavily stylized watercolor painting of Miyamoto Musashi, apparently in the style of the manga Vagabond. There is a relatively plain background, and the text reads as follows. There is nothing outside of yourself that can ever enable you to get better, stronger, richer, quicker, or smarter. Everything is within. Everything exists. Seek nothing outside of yourself. I had this inspirational quote image come across my Facebook feed a number of years ago, and it just so happens that I had recently finished reading a translation of Goden no Sho included in Tokitsu Kenji's biography of Miyamoto Musashi, who I was researching for a presentation I was working on at the time. While the quote had no sourced attribution, it nevertheless struck me as being wholly antithetical to the spirit Musashi's text conveyed. This piqued my interest enough to see if perhaps I was mistaken. After all, it had been a little while ago, and perhaps because I was researching specific subject matter, I may have simply glossed over that part in the text. Throwing the phrase into Google resulted in 712 million hits, and scrolling through page after page of images and blog posts regurgitating this quote, the closest thing to a source was, time and again, the Book of 5 Rings. Always, however, just the text itself, never any further section or page number. So while Musashi did indeed write other treatises, they tended to be much less widely available than Goren no Sho, and since this text was the only source attributed, I limited my search to it. While not the most scientific methodology, and because I didn't happen to have a copy of the text to hand, I found an online version on archive.org. One Ctrl+F later and a few keystrokes returned 2 results, neither of which contained the quote. So while this could have been some issue of the translation, given the ubiquity of the quote online, it seemed unlikely. Some further searches for synonyms or matching words still resulted in nothing which contained the phrasing, to say nothing of the incongruent messaging. I mentioned it briefly, but for anyone who is not familiar with Goren no Sho, the incongruity is apparent. In the text, Musashi speaks at length about the need to study a wide range of arts to develop a more holistic understanding of his way of combat strategy. Thus, the idea that nothing outside the self can enable you to get better, stronger, richer, quicker, or smarter stands in stark contrast to the very purpose behind the text. Musashi wrote the text in the last years of his life and for the express purpose of developing a text for some of the students of his Niten Ichiryu to pass on his teachings. The idea that a text, which is fundamentally external to the individual, necessarily enables one to develop the perfection of the way of combat strategy, which was after all what Musashi wrote the text for, directly contradicts the quote. It was abundantly clear then that Musashi could not reasonably have been the source of the quote. The question then became, who was, and how had it become associated with Miyamoto Musashi? Sources. I mentioned earlier that the image displayed in this version of the inspirational quote image looked very reminiscent of Inoue Takehiko's Vagabond manga. A Google search later, and it turns out the image is not by Inoue after all, but rather an artist who goes by the name Alex Fei-chan. It was posted to their DeviantArt account in 2014, but the painting itself is dated January 2012. Dates like this can be extremely helpful because it can then provide an earliest terminus for a date-refined Google search. The earliest inspirational quote image I was able to find via Google image search, when they were still available, was to March 12, 2013, when it was uploaded by a Pinterest user who was sharing it from their Facebook. This version features text superimposed over an image of Musashi from the aforementioned Vagabond manga, so the quote attribution is at least as early as 2012. So, I picked 2000 as an arbitrary start date and entered the phrase, "There is nothing outside of yourself," and looked for hits with no results. 2001, on the other hand, provided a result for February 1st, 2001. This is from an upload to Goodreads, which unfortunately, once again, only lists the Book of Five Rings as the source. Nothing earlier, and so short of trying to acquire every extant version of the Book of Five Rings, I was at a dead end. Then, and I honestly cannot recall the precise search string as I did not note it down at the time, I came across a Reddit post which actually linked to the source of "There is nothing outside of yourself," inspirational quote image, and the user traced the quote to author and martial artist Stephen F. Kaufman's Musashi's Book of Five Rings. Well, here it was. Had to get a copy and see for myself. Unfortunately, my local library system did not have any versions of his text available, so I was forced to purchase an ebook version. I was not disappointed. The quote was from section/book 5, No Thing, usually translated as void, page 104 to 105, and reads as follows. The issue is clear, and I explain it as well as anyone else. Even without the literal translation of my Book of Five Rings, you can come close to understanding no thing by realizing that there is nothing outside of yourself that can ever enable you to get better, stronger, richer, quicker, or smarter. Everything is within. Everything exists. Seek nothing outside of yourself. Well, there it was. Here at last was my answer. Except, having looked into a number of online versions already, not one of them had anything like this in their version of Void. So why did Kaufman's? So the full title of the book is Musashi's Book of Five Rings, the definitive interpretation of Miyamoto Musashi's classic book of strategy. The 2012 ebook version was derived from an earlier 2004 paperback edition, which was itself a 10th anniversary edition of the original hardcover, with a slightly different but informative title. The Martial Artist's Book of Five Rings, the definitive interpretation of Miyamoto Musashi's classic book of strategy. The notes from the introduction are very enlightening. What this text is not is a translation. Kaufman actually relied on an existing English translation himself. No, the clue is in the title. This is Kaufman's interpretation of Goden no Sho. The following passage is from a section titled, About the Translation. The majority of translations of Musashi's work available on the market are little more than intellectual exercises in translating Japanese to English. They do not adequately express the feeling required to study life and death confrontations, and therefore fall short of the mark. The present work has been done with the purpose of clearing up the misconceptions of naive Westerners and Easterners as to the real purpose of the five rings. It explains in depth, with additional definition, the truths that must be comprehended before it is possible to come to terms with the teachings of Musashi. It is therefore to be studied as a universal explanation. My intention with the remainder of this video was to not cast aspersions on Hanshi Kaufman himself, but on the text he has written. According to his webpage, Kaufman is listed as being a 10th Dan, hence Hanshi, in Hebi Ryu Budo, a world-renowned martial arts instructor and most impactful international martial arts author of our time. His other works include The Way of the Modern Warrior, Living the Samurai Ideal in the 21st Century, Sun Tzu's Art of War, the definitive interpretation of Sun Tzu's classic book of strategy, and The Sword of the Boardroom. I will, however, heavily criticize his interpretation contained within this text. This is primarily because Kaufman does not present the text he has produced as an interpretation, at least not with what he has actually written. He does not use phrasing like, owing to historic context A, or Kenjutsu principle B, Musashi meant C. Instead, the sections which are translations of Goden no Sho are written in the first person. Kaufman writes using Musashi's pen, so to speak, but does not delineate between the original translated text and his interpretation of it. I don't think you have to be a historian or an academic to understand why this would be a problem. Other versions of the book, or scroll, or chapter, void, no thing, or ether, have the last section read as follows. In Victor Harris's, the original English translation, it reads, In the void is virtue, and no evil. Wisdom has existence. Principle has existence. The way has existence. Spirit is nothingness. 12th day of the 5th month, 2nd year of Shōho, 1645. Teru Magonojo, Shinmuen Musashi. Or, in my personal favorite version, Alexander Bennett's translation, There is good, not evil, in the ether. There is wisdom. There is reason. There is the way. The mind, empty. 12th day of the 5th month, Shōho 2, 1645. Shinmen Musashi Genshin. 2, Tero Magonojo. The fifth section is actually quite short, usually no more than 3 pages in most translations. Kaufman's has an additional page and a half of text, which is where his interpretation takes over. And I must be honest, his interpretation is not very good at all. Frankly, in my opinion, it's rubbish. There is an almost respectable temerity in Kaufman for believing that he could put words into Musashi's mouth and claim it as authoritative. I mean, Musashi is only one of the most celebrated swordsmen in history. Surely an American karateka from the 20th century is the most reliable interpreter one could hope for. No. It's awful. The worst part about Kaufman's text is that, at least according to the current Kindle edition I have, the majority of other highlights which see widespread dissemination from the text are again the things that are the invention of Kaufman. My assumption is that since these passages are written to reinforce Kaufman's, and by proxy popular, ideas of the warrior or martialist, as Kaufman refers to his target audience, being predicated on his own experience as a karateka. As such, it is full of Kaufman's own idealized version of what a warrior should be: independent, disciplined, aggressive, and confident. He constantly refers to the universe, supreme spirit, and posits notions like becoming one with one's tools or weapons. The sword is the soul of the samurai, and other well-worn platitudes which are simply absent from the original text and any of Musashi's other writings. Here is a very clear example of how a flawed methodology, and by flawed methodology I mean just making it up, can lead to the spread of misinformation. Think about it. If you are an eager, young, a martial artist or samurai enthusiast, and your initial exposure to Goden no Sho is Kaufman's text, what reason would you have to doubt the text as you are reading it? Granted, he does lay out the scope of his text in the introduction section, but I think a fair assumption could be made that for many people who are not approaching the text academically, they may just skip over that part and dive into the body of the text itself. Kaufman, who leans heavily on his status as a world-renowned martial artist to justify his methodology, ignores the actual text in favor of creating a text which reflects a popular, and therefore marketable, but wholly ahistorical conception of Musashi and his philosophy. I can understand the fiduciary incentive. By the time Kaufman created his version in 1994, the market was lousy with translations and he needed a hook to differentiate his work. And his sentiment sounds esoteric enough, but it also directly appeals to the sort of hyper-individualized cult of the self which is so prevalent in Western, and particularly American, thought. Ironically, turning Goden no Sho into a self-help book marketed towards martial artists seems to be antithetical to Kaufman's proposed purpose. But capitalism is a hell of a drug. A hang-up he also apparently got over, since he has subsequently written several additional texts about adapting Musashi to the boardroom and corporate environments. Where we can find scholastic value in examining the quote is that it reveals far more about the mindset of the author than any worldview held by Musashi. Kaufman, as someone who is obviously ensconced in the practice and culture of Japanese martial arts in America, has had his understanding of Musashi and samurai culture in general shaped by modern conceptions and ideations. The modern, and particularly Western, emphasis on the centrality of Zen in Japanese martial arts, the idealized state of samurai as the perfect warriors, and Musashi as the purest distillation of these warriors, provide the historic perspective Kaufman uses to justify his interpretation. Coupled with this, however, are also modern conceits. Foremost is the absolute atomization of the individual, removed from any sociocultural context, into a universalized totality unto itself. If you are a failure, you have no one and nothing to blame other than yourself. Further, there's a very thick veneer of unbridled aggression woven throughout Kaufman's text. From the outset, he makes it plain that his version is not for academics, businessmen, that would come later, or even martial artists, but martialists. This is a book for martialists, not martial artists. The concept of art can lead to a misunderstanding of the warrior's purpose and preclude a subjective relationship to form and function. For, paradoxically, the warrior is all passion although he shows none, and kills without hesitation. The reality is one of neither subjectivity nor objectivity. In several sections, his embellishments reflect a violence which is lacking in Musashi's text. It is not difficult to come to the conclusion that Kaufman has a very specific vision of what a storied warrior like Musashi would really be like, and so through his additional definition, parlays this aggression for the benefit of his reader. A warrior has only one objective: to destroy the enemy by whatever means necessary. If you do not understand this teaching, then how can you ever hope to do what you are trying to accomplish? You must go into combat with the attitude of absolutely destroying the enemy. If you do not develop this attitude, what are you doing there in the first place? Combat fighting is not done for fun. Even in practice sessions, you must have the attitude of going in for the kill. This certainly sounds like something a famous warrior would say, which is precisely the point. There is a vociferous machismo in the text that has literally been put into the mouth of Musashi. This is where a close academic translation and interpretation becomes so very important to developing a historicized understanding of the text, and where the pure martialist interpretation falls flat. Even worse, people who read this text, 1 million copies sold and its now over 25-year publication history, but who don't understand that it isn't Musashi but Kaufman writing, means the actual word of Musashi are lost. Inspirational quote images get shared around the world, and in turn, this means that the single most commonly attributed quote of Miyamoto Musashi is a complete fabrication. I also don't think it is particularly good advice. I believe that there is far too much of an atomized and hyper-individualized mindset in society already, and especially in North America, which is indicative of a much deeper state of alienation. Kaufman, for all his aggressive bravado, is no more immune to the social and economic forces which produced this mindset, but it remains a problem nevertheless. Placing the responsibility for any given individual's lot in life as causally dependent on their own agency alone ignores the historic reality for most people in most times. Musashi composed Goten no Sho in the last years of his life, in order to leave instruction and insight for his students to carry on the system he developed. If Musashi was the rugged individualist with no concern for the social reality of the transmission of Kenjutsu in the 17th century, or for the continuity of the Niten Ichiryu, we most certainly wouldn't even have had a text for Kaufman to interpret in the first place. Conclusion. If you are interested in a more thorough investigation of Goten no Sho, and I've already mentioned it, The Complete Musashi, The Book of Five Rings and Other Works, by Alexander Bennett, would be my personal recommendation. Dr. Bennett is a renowned scholar and martial artist, and so you get the benefit of both an excellent translation with ample footnotes, as well as practical guides for the actual sections involving Kenjutsu, which is usually lacking in other translations. I hope you enjoyed this video. If you have any questions or comments, please let me know below. If you did like the video and think it is merited, please give me a thumbs up. If you disliked the video, please show your displeasure by giving me a thumbs down. If you know anyone who might also appreciate the video, please share it with them. If you want to see what I have coming up next, subscribe to the channel. Thanks for your time.